The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
You know, the saint we're going to begin with is Saint Fidelis. His full name is Saint Fidelis of Sigmaringen and from Germany. Mm-hmm. So let's tell the folks about Fidelis, his birth and his death.
Well, born in the late 16th century, 1578. He dies in the year 1622, and as you said, in Germany. He studied law and philosophy, so he would have been a highly educated individual. He enters the Capuchin order, and this is where he receives the name Fidelis, which is translated faithful. And so, there may be other names of saints that have been given to people when they enter religious life that has some meaning. But to be given the name faithful, there had to have been reasons. They had to have noticed and seen in his life that he would truly live up to that name. It's not a name that you're just going to throw out at somebody and then have them live a whole different life. We know that as he lived his life, he was appointed to the propagation of the faith, and that one of the interesting roles that he had was to preach to the Protestants in Switzerland and Austria. So we look at this time frame and we see the rise of Protestantism, the rise of people who have splintered off of the Catholic Church, and yet there was something about Fidelis that this sense of faithfulness to the church was still kind of captivating them, trying to bring them back into the fold.
We know that obviously Saint Fidelis was a martyr, and of course all of the Counter-Reformation that he would have been part of in the turmoil that would have gone in with that certainly tells us what would have happened in Western Europe, especially in the countries of Germany and Switzerland and Austria. So that whole sense that he had this tremendous zeal for defending the Catholic faith. And normally, that's what makes someone a martyr, someone who dies defending the Catholic faith. Let's talk about that whole idea of martyrdom. We know that in the life of the early church, all of the saints, if not most of them, would have been considered saints because they were martyred, defending the faith. And here we have, in this time and age, even though we're talking several centuries ago, there's this whole sense that because someone believes in Christ, someone believes in the church, they're put to death for that, in the name of Christ and in the name of the church. So that's really something that we find hard to understand and comprehend, even in this modern world that we live in.
Well, certainly, probably a great challenge in comprehending it of Fidelis and people of his time frame is, oftentimes when we're talking about martyrdom in the church, we're talking about people who, those who martyr them, are not part of a Christian faith at all. Mm-hmm. But now we're talking about someone who is part of the Counter-Reformation, where it's Protestant against Catholic. And you would think that although there are still great divides between the Protestant faiths and the Catholic faith, that certainly they would not amount to putting someone to death. But this is still a time period, if we recall, one of the great activities of the church, especially at the time of the First Reformation, and then as it moves forward, certainly in England and beyond, is the wealth of the church, the power of the church, the prestige of the church. And so when you see others who have gained their own wealth, their own power, their own prestige, they don't want to lose a grip on that. And so we've talked in other shows about not wanting to wade too much into political aspects of it, but we're studying a historical time frame where very much politics, power, prestige, wealth, that's part and parcel of what many who became Protestant and now were living that life of faith had achieved. Some of the same things they decried in the Catholic Church, they themselves had started to amass. And so this Counter-Reformation, it's not about necessarily some of the aspects of Catholic doctrine, though that's certainly part of it. But a lot of it would also be, what does it mean if we lose our people, if they decide to go back to being Catholic, where are we? What have we lost? What do we no longer have? And so it's not a different type of martyrdom, but it's a different type of motive placed on the martyrdom.
It's interesting as you talk about that. He was canonized a little over a century after his martyrdom. So there's that whole sense that the church really took its time in declaring this martyr who, with great zeal, defended the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith, but took its time. And so we have to, as church, look at what is going on in the life of these particular saints who give their life for the church, and not readily and immediately declare them a saint just because they were martyred. So there's that whole sense, it's a bigger picture that we need to look at. And perhaps that time frame, or that time span of waiting almost 100 plus years to canonize him, was a sense that it allowed more people to understand that the faith that Fidelis stood up for was the true faith, the true church that others could join and also subsequently defend as Fidelis did.
Absolutely. And you know, that relationship with the church is so important, but also we're very aware of where the church fits into society. And so we've mentioned this in the past, or talked about some other countries and other time frames where while we're not giving in to any political discord, you have to also be worried about the people of God, the faithful living at that time. And so to declare someone a saint immediately, you have to think about the safety, the protection, the well-being of the people there. And what did that mean in relationship to leading more people to the faith? It could have been very likely that although martyred, if immediately declared and venerated and raised up, it would have been seen perhaps as an attack and a ridicule on other people that you were still trying to bring to the faith. So it doesn't diminish Fidelis' role, but we could say that perhaps his life story allowed that slow progression back to the faith for many people.
And let's go back to his name, Fidelis. That whole sense of him being faithful. And we know that once he joined the Capuchin order, that he received that name from them. So it wasn't a name that he was given closer to his martyrdom, but it was a name that was given him when he took on the habit as a Capuchin monk. So there's that sense that even then they knew that he would be faithful. So there's that sense that being faithful to God is not something that happens right before we're martyred, but it's something that's given to us that grows and nurtures throughout our entire life. We're going to take a break and talk about two more saints in just a moment. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
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 What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about St. Philip and St. James. They were apostles. Let's remind the folks that are with us what exactly is an apostle.
Again, those apostles are those, especially in the first 12, uniquely called to that personal relationship with the Lord, but who at one point or another then are sent out to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, specifically to a select group of people. So we know in the first 12, legend has it that the 11, after Judas hangs himself and Jesus dies and is raised from the dead, they all go out as he told them to go out and baptize all the nations. But then we know that there's been others that have been called to the role of apostle, whether it's to a specific land or a specific group of people. But here we're actually talking about 2 of the original 12.
And what's interesting, at least in the life of Philip, is that he was really the 3rd apostle that was called according to tradition. So immediately after St. Peter and St. Andrew, then St. Philip was called. What's interesting following that is that scripturally he goes to his friend Nathaniel and encourages him to follow Jesus. And remember in the scriptures it says, Nathaniel responds, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip says, "Well, come and see." Isn't that really kind of like the quiet invitation to the good news? We really don't cram it down people's throats. We say, "Come and see." And when they come and see the Lord and understand, then there's this whole transformation. There's this conversion, or what we call maybe metanoia, that someone understands that this is important for me to follow. This person is the one who I want to give my life to. So let's talk a little bit about Philip, and then we'll talk about James.
Well, I think certainly, as you mentioned, that beautiful invitation, to be called into this service of the Lord, to want to witness this, to want to bring others along. And I think as we look at Philip, and we could say that it's the work of all of the apostles, but we know very little. I mean, there's some scriptural references, but we know of the great work of Peter. We know the great work of the beloved disciple John. We know Andrew is the first called. But I would say that as we look at specifically the work of Philip, that's where we maybe are really finding us. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that before, of how do we model and pattern ourselves after the apostles. And certainly we have our moments of being Peter. We have our moments of being John. But I think for many of us, maybe it's being the Philips that are out there. That there is that call to come and see the Lord, to come and witness to the Lord, to come and be part of his message of peace and forgiveness, of charity and service, and that it's just kind of lived out in those day-to-day interactions. Certainly Philip, like the other apostles, the scriptures give us these highlighted moments, but it would have been a lot of days of perhaps downtime. You're on the road journeying from this village to that village. Not every day was the Sermon on the Mount. Not every day was feeding 5,000. But there would have been just those constant opportunities to listen to the Lord, to open your ears, but also your heart and your mind, and to allow that message to seep in. And I think that is kind of what I get from Philip and a few of the other disciples, that we don't necessarily have these grand moments of them in the Gospels, like we do with Peter or John. But we fill in the blanks of what that faithfulness throughout that 3-year journey would have been.
Well, and we would have known, and we know through the life of the church, that the apostles, save for St. John, were all martyred for their faith. Mm-hmm. And so within this 3-year span of their relationship with Jesus, of actually responding to his call, his invitation to follow him, going, seeing him, living with him, day to day, hour to hour, they would have become so saturated, if you will, with his mission and his purpose, that would have given them the desire to go out following that first Pentecost with the blessing of the Spirit, to preach the gospel and the good news to every nation. And so there's that whole sense that starting with his own call, Philip's own call by the Lord, or from the Lord, and then subsequently going to his friend and asking him to come and see the Lord. So there's that whole, and this would have been a new apostle. And so imagine what he would have said to others after 3 years of being with the Lord.
And also, as you said, even in these quiet moments, in this saturation, but to build up the strength and the courage to then bear witness to it. When we talk about ultimately dying a martyr's death, but even seeing that last week with Jesus, you know, to have been there and witnessed the triumphant entrance into Jerusalem, and then to be feasting on that meal, but then being challenged to be a person of great service. But then the very difficult part, and this is perhaps of 3 years, the greatest challenge of faith to the disciples, is to witness the agony in the garden, to witness the arrest, to witness all that happens on Good Friday, to be in fear of their own lives, but not to waver. Yes, there might have been these moments of their own safety and security. We know they were locked away, but to then able to go forth and to think of the great, we talked about Paul's conversion. We don't talk enough about the apostles' conversion. We think they've got it all figured out. Jesus tells them they don't. But we think maybe they're formed when he calls them. No, it was a 3-year conversion. And they needed all of that to be able to go out after the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection and Pentecost to truly do the work that he had called them to.
In our last 2 minutes of our segment, we want to get in St. James. We know that he is a son of Alphaeus. He's called the brother of Jesus. He's considered James the Less because James, the brother of John, would have been called prior to him, so he would be considered James the Great. We know that he is the head of the church in Jerusalem and became known also as James the Just. They were both martyred in 62, and we believe scripture scholars say that he is the author of the epistle. Their feast is on May 1st. In our last final few seconds, what would you like to share with the folks about St. James the Less?
Well, I think in our understanding of James's letter, you know, and as we look at James, his writing really is one that when you talk about that justice, that calls us into that discipleship. A lot of the little quotes that we can recall from him are talking about our work. You know, one of the great lines from James is to be doers of the word, not hearers only, thus deluding yourself. And so that sense of justice would come from not just hearing the word of God, but putting it into practice. And isn't that ultimately the work of the apostles? They heard the word of Jesus, but they saw him put it into action. He didn't just talk about healing, he healed. He didn't just talk about feeding the poor, he fed the 5,000. And so we see that James's relationship with the Lord and then his relationship with others, being that conduit, really is about taking that word and putting it into active practice. That's where you find the justice of that relationship with God, to be doers of the word, not hearers only. So I think James serves as a beautiful example of how we continue to share that life of Christ with others.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about another saint that probably is not very well known. However, much of what he is known for is pretty significant in a lot of things that we as Catholics believe and even say today, in particular the Nicene Creed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But his name is Athanasius of Alexandria. Let's tell the folks that are with us when he was born and when he died.
Well, he's born in the year 296, and what's important about that is it's still illegal to be a Christian when he is born, but because of his young age, the church, it becomes legal in the year 313 with the Edict of Milan. So his, growing into the maturity of faith, into the adulthood, there's no fear of martyrdom for him. And so he's able then to become part of the church. Now, we know that he was born into a wealthy family, but a wealthy Christian family. And they could have already been Christian before he was born, but a secret Christian, thus protecting their wealth, protecting their lives. But then it's acceptable for him, even with a family of wealth, to move into the church. And we know that although he becomes the Bishop of Alexandria, at one point he was the assistant to the Bishop of Alexandria during the time of the Council of Nicaea. Now, what's interesting is we're told that he is the 20th Bishop of Alexandria. Now, the Diocese of Youngstown is about to celebrate its 75th anniversary. We are on our 5th bishop. So to be the 20th bishop this early on in the church also reminds us of the turnover, that it was illegal. Many bishops of Alexandria were martyred. Many bishops perhaps were older and did not live very long. So to be the 20th bishop in his lifespan, it just kind of puts into perspective what it was like to be part of the church during the legal period and then even after. So I just wanted to highlight that for us. We know that Gregory Nazianzen called him a great pillar of the church. So you have another person who's a saint recognize the real role that Athanasius is called to live out in the church.
What's also interesting is where he is from. We know he's from Alexandria. Alexandria would have been an important port city of the time, being right there on the Mediterranean. And so that whole sense that he would have understood not only learning about the faith, but understood world travel, would have understood commerce, would have understood law. And so there's that whole sense that as an assistant to the bishop, he would have probably had lots of knowledge that would have helped the bishop govern the Archdiocese of Alexandria. So there's that whole sense that what he provides to the bishop and what he provides to the church at the time was very profound. We know that the Council of Nicaea, which was in the year 325, where the church actually was allowed to practice its faith visibly, probably going back to 313 with the Edict of Milan and Constantine, but 325 with the Council of Nicaea, defining those doctrines of our faith, belief in God, Father, Son, and Spirit, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. There's that whole sense that is when the church really began to flourish publicly. There's a word, and we know that historically in Athanasius's own life and schooling, that he coined for the Nicene Creed that we use now in our Nicene Creed that we didn't use many hundreds of years ago. So what was that word, and what are we talking about?
Well, he coins the phrase consubstantial, and it is a word to describe the relationship of the Father and the Son, finding this unity between the two of them. And as you mentioned, it's a word that now we've been saying in the Nicene Creed, which is the more predominant version of the creed that is professed at Masses on Sunday. Some parishes may use the Apostles' Creed from time to time, but the preferential version would be the Nicene Creed. And in 2011, with the changes, the restoration of the liturgy and the language, we got back to consubstantial. Before that, we would have said one in being with. And when people would start to ask me, well, what does consubstantial mean? I would say one in being with. It was just a different translation of the word. But it is really, whether it's one in being with or consubstantial, it is describing that the Father and the Son are in complete unison. You know, that they are together, they are united. Yes, we know the Father, the Son, the Spirit, they have different roles that they play out, but as this one Godhead, that there is no difference in how we offer our reverence to that God, Father, Son, and Spirit, how we adore that God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and in their ultimate work of leading us closer to them. And so we see that there is that sense that the Father and the Son, and what the early church in Nicaea, and it becomes a struggle in a few other consequent councils, is always trying to find this understanding of how can it possibly be? You know, people of good faith, but the Father has to be up here, the Son has to be subordinate, the Spirit's just off over here. And so people of good faith continue to struggle with that. And I would say people of good faith today still maybe create their own hierarchical structure of the Father, Son, and Spirit. But what was started at Nicaea, continued in Ephesus and Constantinople, was the need for that understanding that we have a triune God, a Father, Son, and Spirit, but equal in majesty, equal in reverence, equal in our relationship with them.
And when we say Alexandria, we remind people that that's in Egypt. So we're talking about really the eastern part of the church. And oftentimes when we talk about the church as east and west, you can look at it anatomically with having two lungs. You know, we breathe out of two lungs, and so the church is at its most full or fullest when we have breath out of both lungs with the east and the west. And so we really highlight Athanasius and also Gregory of Nazianzen and those of the Eastern Church who have been pillars, who have been forthright, who have stood and give us these doctrines that we continue to proclaim and to preach and to profess centuries and millennia afterwards. We'd like to encourage the folks who are with us again to learn more about the saints we talk about. Go to your internet to learn more, and we thank them for being with us, and have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.